Exam 3 review for Chapter 12. The overview of Chapter 12, which is Physician Markets, we're looking at it in that structure, conduct, performance paradigm. Under structure, we talked about the supply of physicians per capita. We talked about how physicians are reimbursed. We talked about competitiveness of the industry and the production function of the physician markets and how production of physician services can be more efficient. On the conduct side, we talked about supplier-induced demand. We talked about self-referral and the Stark Act. We talked about movement to value-based purchasing, that is pay for performance, bundled payment, shared savings program. Talked about geographic variation and the Dartmouth Atlas. Talked about utilization review, how it's historically been prospective and now it's moving toward a more retrospective approach. And we talked about malpractice law. On performance, we just overviewed spending and how spending has been changing over time on physician services, and we talked about physicians' income. I'm not going to go into all of these in detail. There are just a few of these that I'm going to dig into with a little more focus. On the structure side, let's look at the supply of physicians. We talked about how the supply of physicians per 100,000 employees varies across the country. We talked about how it was growing. We talked about how the fraction of physicians that are primary care physicians varies from state to state. So you want to go back and look at all those things in your notes. We talked about how physicians are increasingly supported by mid-levels or advanced practice providers. I think that latter term is the more politically correct term. The scope of practice for APPs varies by state. Some nurse practitioners in some states can write prescriptions on their own and offer healthcare services to individuals without being under the supervision of a physician, but in other states they are closely supervised by physicians and the physicians have to do the prescription writing. There is a trend toward physicians working in larger multi-specialty care systems as opposed to single specialty solo practices. Government is a big source of payment and a leader in payment reform. We've talked about these things over and over again. On the physician side, the resource-based relative value schedule, the movement toward a relative values from one fee to the next and a fee structure. We've talked about bundled payments for very well-defined packages of services like a knee replacement, and we've talked about the shared savings program. Competitiveness. There are barriers to entry to the physician service, so go back and look at those barriers to entry. And there is quite a bit of regulation in the physician services industry because of informational asymmetry, and so there are things like licensing and so on to provide some assurance that there is a minimum quality provided by the physicians. We also, as I said, in structure, we talked about production efficiencies and how does the production function operate for the physician market. And we said that there are efficiencies when mid-levels, those advanced practice providers, practice at the top of the license. Efficiencies are better when physicians move from solo to group practices. There are some economies of scale, but they're pretty modest. Do those economies of scale top out when a group is only 5 to 7 docs? And there's not real clear evidence of economies of scope, bringing in multiple types of services like cardiology and radiology and orthopedics all in one large group. The marginal productivities of physicians is really high compared to those mid-levels, but of course the cost of the physician is high too. But with these production efficiencies and what I've just described here with modest economies of scale and no economies of scope, why are we seeing really large multi-specialty practices emerge then if the cost structure is not incenting that? Well, it's really because of other things going on, not cost efficiencies, but because of the negotiations with insurers and market power needed to negotiate with that very consolidated insurance company. So that's one thing going on. Also, these new reimbursement methods that we've talked about and the pay for performance and the shared savings and bundled payment you have to have a large group. Often with the shared savings, it's got to be hospitals and physicians together and all the specialties covered so that you can manage the whole scope of care and negotiate prices for that whole scope of care altogether. And so that's part of why we're seeing these large multi-specialty practices emerge, even though the production function doesn't really lead you to think that they would. Okay, on conduct, I'm just going to dig into a few of the topics. One of the topics I want to talk about is supplier-induced demand. So one of the concerns is, or the theories is, because there are more doctors entering the market over time. We talked about that at the very beginning, we talked about structure of the market, and we talked about the supply of physicians per 100,000. If you go back and look at your notes, you'll see that the number of docs per 100,000 has been growing. And so with those docs entering the market, you would expect to see price drop. That's on the left-hand graph. Anytime supply moves out, when demand is constant, you would expect quantity to go out and price to go down. And so the theory of supplier-induced demand is that physicians compensate for that by counseling their patients to use more services. They try to push up quantity to make up for the price. So you'll see if what I've put on the right side is I've picked up just that S1 supply line and the original demand, and I've shown what happens if you also then have demand move out because the physicians are encouraging patients to use more services. And you'll see that then prices go back up, whether they're higher or lower than the original price 0 over on the left-hand side, I don't know, but definitely quantity will go up from Q1 to Q2. So you might be recovering price and having higher quantity, or you may be pushing up price. It might still be lower than the original price before the physician supply increased, but at least you're getting higher quantity, so your total revenue is back up where you expect it to be. There are two reasons why states have established malpractice law. One is to compensate the victims of medical errors, and the other is to create deterrence for physicians being careless in the future. There are several concerns about the malpractice situation right now. Concerns like frivolous lawsuits tend to be happening, concerns about excessive awards from juries, concerns about the threat of a malpractice lawsuit leading physicians to practice defensive medicine, and the fact that rising malpractice premiums may be driving medical trends. So go back and look at those things in your notes. We also talked about state-based tort reform efforts, and there is that they find that limits on non-economic damages, that is pain and suffering, are most impactful in controlling malpractice costs. That's a summary of just a few of the topics under conduct. And then in performance, we just looked at spending. We talked about physician CPI trends being higher than general CPI, about 1% per year higher than general CPI. Utilization is also going up about 2.5% each year over this 2-decade interval that I'm talking about, 1990 to 2010. The utilization increases are a combination of the actual number, the count of services going up, and also the mix of services, skewing to more complex services. And some of that growth in complexity and numbers is justified by the population growth, by the population aging and becoming more sick, and by the increase in technology that allows us to do more complex things. We also talked about physician income. It's declined in real terms, although it's still much higher than other developed countries. And the physician income, some of the income changes are driven by moving from being the owner of the practice to salaried employment, perhaps through a hospital that now owns the clinic. And the increase in Medicare and Medicaid is a fraction of the practice, which of course drives down the average fees because they reimburse at lower rates. And that wraps up our summary of this chapter.